There was a time when warning signs triggered immediate reaction, when sudden change felt alarming and disruption demanded attention. But that time seems to have passed. Today, events that would once have stopped the world barely slow it down. Headlines scroll endlessly, crises overlap, and each new development competes with the last for attention before fading into the background. People still notice that something feels off, but the feeling no longer produces urgency, it produces fatigue. The danger does not announce itself with panic anymore. It arrives disguised as routine. This is how the endgame begins, not with chaos, but with calm acceptance. The most unsettling shift is not what has changed, but how people respond to change. There is a growing sense that nothing is surprising anymore. Measures that once sparked debate are now met with quiet resignation. Restrictions are discussed casually. Long-term consequences are postponed mentally because short-term survival feels more pressing. People adapt quickly, telling themselves that adjustment is maturity, that resilience means learning to live with whatever comes next. Over time, adaptation replaces resistance, and resistance starts to feel childish or unrealistic. The emotional response that once accompanied major shifts has dulled. This numbness is not accidental. When disruption becomes constant, the nervous system recalibrates. What once felt extreme becomes baseline. The extraordinary becomes ordinary simply through repetition. People stop asking whether a situation is acceptable and focus instead on how to manage within it. The question quietly changes from "should this be happening?" to "how do I live with this?" That shift marks a critical psychological turning point. When people move from evaluation to endurance, systems no longer need to justify themselves. Normal life becomes the cover. Work continues. Bills are paid. Entertainment flows. Social routines remain intact enough to suggest stability, even as underlying structures shift. This surface-level normality reassures people that nothing fundamental could be wrong. After all, if things were truly dangerous, wouldn't it feel different? Wouldn't there be a clear signal? This assumption is the trap. The endgame does not feel dramatic because drama invites resistance. It feels familiar because familiarity disarms scrutiny. Another layer of the problem is comparison. People measure the present against imagined worst-case scenarios rather than against what existed before. As long as conditions are not catastrophic, they are framed as acceptable. This lowers expectations gradually. Each step down feels tolerable because it follows the last. What matters is not where people are, but how far they have moved without noticing. When expectations fall slowly, loss is rarely recognized as loss. Social reinforcement plays its part. When most people appear calm, concern feels inappropriate. Questioning the direction of change feels awkward, even disruptive. Silence is rewarded with social ease. Curiosity feels like unnecessary stress. Over time, people learn not to dwell on what they cannot immediately change. This sounds practical. It is also how awareness is deferred indefinitely. This chapter establishes the central warning. The endgame does not begin when people panic, it begins when they stop panicking altogether. When Nothing feels urgent anymore, not because everything is safe, but because urgency has been exhausted. History shows that the most consequential shifts rarely happen at the height of outrage. They happen after outrage burns out, when acceptance quietly takes its place. The question is not whether something significant is unfolding. The question is whether the absence of urgency is being mistaken for stability. Almost every major change begins with reassurance. The word temporary is used not to describe duration, but to neutralize resistance. When people believe something will pass, they tolerate it. They comply without protest because compliance feels practical rather than submissive. This is how systems gain footholds without confrontation. Temporary measures arrive framed as solutions to emergencies, adjustments to unusual circumstances, or precautions taken just in case. They are presented as reasonable responses, not structural shifts. And because they are framed this way, they are rarely examined for what they might become. The transition from temporary to permanent is never announced. There is no clear moment when an expiration date is removed. Instead, the language changes subtly. What was once described as short-term becomes necessary. What was necessary becomes standard. What was standard becomes how things are done now. Each step feels small enough to accept, especially when reversing it would feel inconvenient or risky. People tell themselves there will be a better time to question it later once things settle down. But that moment never arrives. Normalization depends on repetition. When people encounter the same condition repeatedly without immediate harm, their threshold for concern rises. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The inconvenient becomes routine. Over time, people stop remembering what life felt like before the change. This forgetting is crucial. You cannot miss what you no longer recall clearly. The past fades, and with it, the reference point needed to recognize loss. Permanence is achieved not by enforcement, but by erosion of memory. Another factor is dependency. Temporary systems often create new forms of reliance. Once people adjust their lives around them, financially, socially, or emotionally, removal feels destabilizing. What was once framed as optional begins to feel indispensable. At that stage, resistance does not just challenge authority, it threatens comfort and predictability. People begin to defend the very structures they once questioned, not because they believe in them, but because they have built their lives around them. Social pressure accelerates this process. As more people accept the temporary arrangement, it gains legitimacy. Those who hesitate are framed as unreasonable or unwilling to adapt. Conformity becomes a measure of responsibility. The conversation shifts away from whether the change should continue and toward why some people refuse to move on. In this way, the burden of justification moves from those who introduce the change to those who question it. What makes this stage of the endgame particularly dangerous is how reasonable it feels. Nothing appears forced. No dramatic crackdown occurs. People are not told they have lost choice. They simply stop exercising it. When choice fades gradually, it does not feel like loss. It feels like maturity, realism, or progress. By the time permanence is acknowledged, it is often described as inevitable. The idea of reversal sounds impractical, even irresponsible. This chapter reveals a quiet truth. Permanence is rarely imposed directly. It is accepted indirectly. The endgame advances not through shock, but through patience. Systems wait for people to settle, adapt, and forget. When they do, permanence no longer needs to be justified. It is simply assumed. The most important moment is not when a change is introduced, but when people stop asking when it will end. That is when temporary quietly becomes forever. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, and that strength is also their vulnerability. When circumstances change slowly enough, the mind recalibrates without protest. What would have felt unacceptable if introduced suddenly becomes manageable when introduced gradually. This is not denial, it is survival instinct. People learn to conserve emotional energy by adjusting expectations rather than constantly resisting reality. Over time, adaptation is praised as resilience, flexibility, and maturity. The danger is that adaptation can quietly replace judgment. When people focus on coping instead of questioning, systems no longer need to justify themselves. Adaptation works by reframing discomfort as normal. At first, a change feels intrusive. Then it feels inconvenient. Eventually, it feels routine. Each stage reduces emotional friction. The mind seeks stability, and stability is found not by reversing change, but by integrating it. This is how people come to defend conditions they once opposed. They are not convinced by argument, they are worn down by repetition. The longer something exists without immediate catastrophe, the safer it appears. Time itself becomes proof. Another powerful force is comparison. People measure their situation not against what was lost, but against worse possibilities. As long as things are not as bad as they could be, acceptance feels rational. Gratitude is encouraged for what remains rather than concern for what has disappeared. This mindset narrows perception. Instead of asking whether a system is fair or sustainable, people ask whether they can manage within it. The question shifts from ethics to endurance. Social reinforcement deepens this process. When most people adapt, resistance begins to feel abnormal. Questioning is framed as negativity. Concern is interpreted as overreaction. The individual senses that pushing back will bring social cost with little immediate reward. Silence becomes easier. Adaptation becomes collective, not because everyone agrees, but because no one wants to stand alone. In this environment, compliance does not feel coerced. It feels sensible. The most unsettling aspect of adaptation is how it rewires identity. People begin to see themselves as the kind of person who gets on with things. Pride is taken in endurance. Suffering becomes proof of character. This identity discourages questioning because questioning would imply weakness or failure to cope. The system benefits enormously from this reframing. A population that identifies with endurance will endure almost anything. Over time, adaptation creates emotional distance from change itself. People stop feeling outrage, not because conditions improve, but because outrage is exhausting. Emotional fatigue sets in. Attention turns inward toward personal survival rather than outward toward collective direction. The broader picture blurs. Life becomes a series of adjustments rather than a trajectory with purpose. This narrowing of focus is subtle but decisive. Large-scale shifts no longer feel like something that can be influenced. They feel like weather to be endured. This chapter reveals a difficult truth. The end game does not rely on force alone. It relies on psychology. Systems advance not only because they are powerful, but because people are adaptive. Adaptation makes the abnormal livable and the unacceptable tolerable. It transforms resistance into routine. The danger is not that people adapt. The danger is that they stop noticing what they are adapting to. When adaptation becomes automatic, awareness fades. And when awareness fades, the direction of change is no longer questioned. The end game progresses most smoothly when people believe they are simply adjusting to life. By the time they realize they have adjusted to something irreversible, adaptation has already done its work. Silence rarely begins as surrender. It begins as caution. At first, people stop speaking because they are unsure, because they want more information, because they don't want to overreact. Silence feels temporary, sensible, even mature. Speaking out feels premature. Over time, however, caution hardens into habit. The absence of objection becomes a default setting, and silence takes on a moral tone. Not speaking is framed as being reasonable, balanced, or respectful. Those who raise concerns are labeled emotional, divisive, or irresponsible. The shift is subtle but decisive. Silence is no longer the absence of action, it is the correct action. This transformation happens because silence carries social rewards. It avoids conflict. It preserves relationships. It allows people to continue functioning without disruption. In environments where change feels overwhelming, silence becomes a form of self-care. People tell themselves they are protecting their mental health, focusing on what they can control, or refusing to be drawn into negativity. All of this feels rational. Yet the cumulative effect is a narrowing of public conversation. What cannot be spoken about safely eventually cannot be spoken about at all. As silence spreads, it creates a false sense of consensus. When few people speak critically, it appears that most people agree. This illusion reinforces itself. Individuals who feel concern look around, see little visible dissent, and assume they are in the minority. They doubt their own perception. Silence feeds more silence. What began as individual restraint becomes collective quiet, not because disagreement vanished, but because expression did. Silence also shifts responsibility. When no one objects, systems interpret quiet as acceptance. Decisions move forward unchallenged. Changes solidify. Later, when consequences become undeniable, the absence of early objection is used to justify permanence. If it was such a problem, why didn't anyone say anything? The question ignores the conditions that discourage speech in the first place. Silence is weaponized retroactively. One of the most dangerous aspects of this stage is how it reframes speaking out as harmful. Raising concerns is accused of spreading fear, undermining stability, or creating unnecessary tension. The focus moves away from whether a concern is valid and toward whether it is disruptive. Order is prioritized over truth. Calm becomes more important than clarity. In this environment, silence is not just encouraged, it is expected. Over time, people internalize these expectations. They censor themselves before anyone else needs to. Questions die quietly in the mind. Conversations are steered away from sensitive topics. Jokes replace critique. Irony replaces analysis. The public space empties of substance while appearing active. Noise remains, but meaning thins out. This is how silence can exist even when people are constantly talking. What makes this phase of the endgame so effective is that it feels ethical. Silence is framed as kindness, patience, or social responsibility. Those who break it are framed as selfish or reckless. The moral pressure to remain quiet becomes stronger than any external threat. When people police themselves, control no longer needs to announce itself. This chapter reveals a hard truth. Silence is not neutral. It shapes outcomes as surely as action does. When silence becomes the responsible choice, it signals that the space for meaningful disagreement has already narrowed. By the time people realize that silence has enabled permanence, speaking out feels not only difficult, but futile. The end game does not require universal agreement. It requires enough silence to make disagreement irrelevant. There is a moment quiet, almost unremarkable, when people realize that what they tolerated has accumulated into something permanent. It does not arrive with sirens or declarations. It arrives in hindsight. Someone notices that an old option no longer exists, that a door once assumed to be open is now closed without explanation. A request that would once have been negotiable is now non-negotiable. A rule that once felt flexible is enforced without discussion. This is the moment the end game locks in. Not because something new has happened, but because nothing can be undone. What makes this moment so unsettling is how normal it feels at first. There is no clear line marking when things crossed from temporary to fixed. People search their memory for the point where they might have objected, where a different outcome was still possible. That point is hard to locate because the change was never singular. It was cumulative. Each small acceptance felt inconsequential. Together, they formed a structure that now feels immovable. The realization often begins privately. People sense it before they articulate it. Conversations trail off. Questions are left unasked because the answers feel predetermined. There is a subtle shift from "should this be happening" to "is there any point in arguing?" That shift is decisive. Once people believe that resistance is futile, the system no longer needs to persuade. Momentum takes over. At this stage, frustration turns inward. People blame themselves for not paying closer attention, for adapting too easily, for assuming there will be time later. But self-blame misses the larger truth. The system did not rely on ignorance, but on patience. It waited for fatigue to replace urgency, for adaptation to replace judgment, for silence to replace debate. By the time people notice the accumulation, the cost of reversal feels too high. Public recognition lags behind private realization. Many individuals sense that something irreversible has happened, but few express it openly. To do so would be to admit that the situation is no longer temporary, that reassurance was misplaced, that normality was not a safeguard. Such admissions are uncomfortable. They threaten identity and stability. So the realization remains mostly unspoken, circulating quietly rather than coalescing into action. The endgame locks in when acknowledgement becomes too late to change direction. Systems are now integrated into daily life. Dependencies have formed, alternatives have withered. Even those who disagree begin to operate within the new boundaries because they must. What was once a choice becomes a condition. Opposition becomes symbolic rather than effective. This chapter reveals a difficult truth. The most decisive phase of change is rarely the most visible. It happens after the debate has ended, after resistance has thinned, after adaptation has settled in. The end game is not the moment of greatest tension, it is the moment of greatest resignation. People often expect that if something truly unacceptable were happening, there would be a clear breaking point, a final straw. In reality, the breaking point is diffuse. It stretches over time, disguised as reasonableness. By the time people agree that the situation is serious, seriousness has already been absorbed into routine. The endgame does not announce itself because announcement invites challenge. It locks in quietly, relying on the assumption that if no one stopped it earlier, no one will stop it now. Recognition arrives not as alarm, but as a heavy understanding. This is no longer a phase. This is the new baseline. Even when the endgame has locked in, one assumption remains dangerously common, that nothing can be done. This belief is understandable, but it is also the final advantage of the system. When people conclude that awareness no longer matters, resignation completes the process that adaptation began. Yet history suggests something more nuanced. While structural change becomes harder, once permanence sets in, perception still shapes outcomes. The difference is timing. Early awareness alters direction. Late awareness alters response. The choice that remains is not about reversing everything, but about how deeply the new reality embeds itself without question. At this stage, the most meaningful shift is internal. People begin to notice patterns rather than events. They stop asking what just happened and start asking how things are unfolding. This perspective change matters. Systems depend not only on compliance, but on unquestioned belief. When belief weakens, even quietly, control loses some of its efficiency. People who see clearly do not necessarily rebel, but they no longer internalize narratives automatically. They pause, they evaluate, they choose their reactions. This alone disrupts predictability. What remains possible is not dramatic uprising, but conscious participation. People can still decide how much of themselves they surrender to normalization. They can still distinguish between adaptation and agreement. They can still speak carefully, support discreetly, and refuse to confuse silence with approval. These actions may not make headlines, but they change the texture of the environment in which power operates. A system facing a population that complies outwardly but sees inwardly is less stable than it appears. This chapter does not promise easy solutions. It offers clarity about limits. The endgame narrows options, but it does not erase agency entirely. Agency shifts from collective momentum to individual awareness. That shift is quieter, slower, and less visible, but it is also harder to extinguish. Awareness spreads laterally, not through slogans or commands, but through recognition. One person notices, Another connects a pattern. Conversations change tone. Questions become more precise. Over time, the narrative loses its total grip. The danger is delay. Awareness deferred becomes acceptance. The longer people wait to acknowledge what has changed, the more normal the new baseline feels. Memory fades. Comparison points vanish. Children grow up knowing only the current arrangement. What once felt like a compromise becomes the starting line. This is why timing matters more than intensity. Loud realization after permanence is less effective than quiet recognition before it fully settles. The final truth of the endgame is not that everything is lost, but that everything becomes harder to reverse, harder to explain, harder to remember differently. That is why the most important work happens before consensus catches up, before language shifts, before silence hardens, before resignation becomes identity. This book ends with a simple, uncomfortable message. The endgame does not remove choice, it redefines it. Choice is no longer about stopping what has begun, but about whether it proceeds unexamined. Whether people accept normal as a conclusion rather than a condition. Whether awareness is treated as pointless because it is late or valuable precisely because time is short. The endgame thrives on the belief that noticing no longer matters. History suggests the opposite. Noticing late is still noticing. And noticing, even quietly, changes what follows. What remains is not the comfort of certainty, but the responsibility of clarity. And clarity, once achieved, does not disappear just because the path ahead is narrow.